Joseph paused as he lowered the larger crystal shard on his shoulder onto the ground near the portal. At first he wasn't sure what he was listening for, but then he realized that everything had grown quiet. The sounds of battle had faded into nothing, and Joseph rose to his feet, scanning the edges of the reality formed by the crystals. Further out in the mist he could just make out the glowing standards of those soldiers who were struggling to maintain the perimeter around the rift which Joseph was trying desperately to tear down. Joseph stared at the violet lights in the fog. A terrible realization dawned on him as he watched, however. He realized that the lights weren't moving. Why was Thorcum keeping their forces still? What had happened? "They'll all be dead," a familiar voice beside Joseph caused him to spin toward it in alarm. There, standing before him, was his sister, Shirka, or at least a passable imitation of her. The creature wearing her face turned to face him as well. "I must remember that she is dead," Joseph thought to himself, resisting the urge to reach out to her. "Death be only a figure in your own mind, Joseph." Shirka's lips parted into a smile, and she leaned closer. "It all be a matter of perspective." Joseph's eyes widened. Could she read minds? "She can't read minds, but your thoughts are written plainly on your face." Joseph turned as another figure seemed to appear behind him. He stared into the eyes of Aelmund, who stood with his hand resting easily on the pommel of his sheathed sword. The elf sighed and shook his head. "Death is simply the change from one form to another. So many mortals try to justify and claim that death and its destination is different from one race or religion to another. But none of that is right. Death is death. Death is change." The elf smiled and walked forward to lay a hand on Joseph's shoulder. "What do you mean?" Joseph asked, licking his lips. Shirka laughed and responded to his question. "You ken what it means, Joseph. This," she spread her arms wide to indicate the fog around them, "this be what awaits ye after ye die. So dinna ye fash yourself o'er Thorcum. E'en he be dead, he be around here." She lowered her arms and smiled at him. Joseph shook his head. "I dinna believe ye," he growled. "This just be a trick to get me to waste time." He walked forward and picked up the crystal he had been hefting and began walking towards the grey material that made up the rift from this side of the void. "Ye should listen to her, lad." Corboom was suddenly before him, shaking his head as Joseph walked forward. "How else will I be here afore ye?" "An act of desperation," Joseph grunted as he continued forward. Something nagged at his senses, and he forced himself to avoid looking at the apparitions before him. "Ye dinna want me to finish the work that I started here." "What do you mean? What work?" Aelmund's voice was steady as he walked up beside Joseph. "If we destroy the pillars there, the rift will collapse," Joseph huffed. Why was he talking to these things? Who was he trying to convince? "Is that what you think? Why would I, or really any of us, wish to stop you from that? We died to see this mission through. Why would we suddenly change simply because we passed from one side of the veil to this one?" Aelmund stepped up and, as if to prove his point, took hold of one side of the crystal to support it, and continued walking alongside Joseph, helping him to carry it towards the nearest pillar. Joseph stopped, and the crystal fell with a heavy thud against the ground. Aelmund gave him a quizzical look. "What is wrong?" he asked. "What's going to happen when the crystals all touch the pillars?" Joseph asked. The three dead people each gave one another a confused look. "We dinna ken," Shirka's face replied. "But we do ken that the pillars be what is holding up the rift, and they have to come down, just like ye said." "Is that what the dark want with us?" Joseph's head spun, and he felt his throat constricting painfully. His vision clouded with tears that he blinked away, refusing to weep before these abominations. "Oh, Joseph." Shirka was suddenly before him, and her arms wrapped around his head, pulling him into an embrace. "I ken this be hard." Jocelyn did not struggle from her arms, and instead found his own pulling her closer. "We ha' all given so much to this. Dinna be afeard. We're here with ye till the end. Shh." She shushed him soothingly as he found himself unable to breathe. His cheeks heated with shame as he lost control of his emotions and fell to his knees. Shirka pulled his face back with her hands and smiled sadly down at him. He closed his eyes and took a shuddering breath. "I dinna ken what to do," he whispered. "Everything be waste. Our home be gone. You're dead. And I dinna ken what'll happen when I use those crystals." "But you do ken what'll happen if you dinna use them." Shirka smiled and patted her brother's cheek. "Up ye come." She placed her hand on his arm and heaved him to his feet. "There be work to be done." Jocelyn shook his head and moved on wooden feet. Picking up the crystal, he continued towards the vortex. As he drew close, he staggered and dropped the crystal. It tumbled forward to land against the base of one of the pillars. "That's it," Shirka encouraged behind him. "Now, I ken that it hurts, but you has to put your hand on the crystal. It be needing your reality to work." A warning bell went off in Jocelyn's mind. How does she know that? The question went largely unheeded in his mind as he reached out to touch the surface of the large crystal. As soon as his palm made contact with it, he screamed with pain as his blood began to boil within him. A fiery pain lanced through his arm and into his chest. The crystal glowed a violent hue of purple, and the ground beneath him began to shake. Jocelyn tried to pull his hand away, but it refused to obey. He opened his eyes, unaware that he'd even closed them against the pain, and saw Shirka with her hand covering his. But something was wrong. Shirka's face was twisted into a cruel smile, displaying blackened teeth and a rotten mouth. Her eyes were glowing red, and when she spoke, her voice was not her own. "Thank you, brother," a silken voice uttered through the rotten teeth in Shirka's mouth. "Our kind do not have enough of the material realm within us to shatter the constraints of our prison. We needed someone from your world to do it for us. Now the rift will no longer be constrained by these terrible pillars, and we will be free to rejoin the mortal world in plagues of thousands and tens of thousands." Shirka's head tilted, and she laughed as Jocelyn stared in horror. The pain in his arm began to fade, and he looked down to see that the crystal's energy had begun to falter. He glanced at the pillar before him and gasped when he saw spiderweb cracks spreading out the length of it. As he continued to stare, the cracks broadened, and in a sudden surge of power both pillars exploded into a cloud of dust that forced Jocelyn to stagger some distance away, where he fell onto his back. "Jocelyn!" Another voice called out to him, and in his confusion Jocelyn could not place it. He lifted his head and saw Thorkim standing over him. "What happened, lad?" the ranger asked. "We heard a great sound and hurried back to see what it was. Some of the soldiers be awake now, but I see that we dinna need 'em for the looks of it." Thorkim pointed at the rift, and Jocelyn turned to look at it as well. The grey material was beginning to spread like a pool of blood, slowly seeping outwards now that it was no longer constrained by the pillars. Jocelyn's eyes fell to the crystals he had heaped at their base in preparation for what he had accomplished with only one crystal. He noticed that Shirka, Elmund, and Korbum, or whatever shades had been impersonating them, were gone. As the rift widened, the purple shards that lay scattered about began to glow more fiercely, and Jocelyn watched as the rift pulled away from them as it passed by. Something began to work in the back of his mind. The crystals were the key. They'd always been the key. "Thorkim, quick!" Jocelyn cried out as he rose to his feet. "Gather the troops and get them through the rift. We need to get back. Also, gather all the stone priests to me. There'll be work that needs to be doing. Every warrior grab as many crystals as he can on the way out." Thorkim didn't hesitate and ran off to follow Jocelyn's orders. The dwarf priest stared at the growing rift and went over the foolish plan forming in his head. He didn't know if it would work, but what other choice did they have?